Letitia James didn't believe in ghosts, but that night, something invisible whispered through the walls of her office, and it wasn't dead. It spoke in tongues, Arabic quick, clipped, Bedouin vowels, and then, just as sharply, a Russian greeting. Not the usual Moscow metro drawl, but deep North Caucasus, like a dagger hidden under a diplomat's coat. That detail struck her harder than the words themselves, because in the office of the Attorney General of New York, nothing foreign ever entered uninvited, and yet here it was, at 9:43 p.m., slicing through silence like a code never meant to be decrypted. James froze mid-sentence, one hand still resting on a thick binder marked "Sensitive Materials, Internal Use Only." Her assistant looked up, puzzled by the sudden pause, but she lifted a finger to her lips, eyes locked on the direction of the hallway just beyond the glass. No one was supposed to be there. No one, except a lone janitor pushing a squeaky cleaning cart. Oliver, mid-40s, average height, American-born at least on paper, always in before dawn, always gone before light, always invisible. Until now. She said nothing then. Letitia was many things: a former public advocate, a hammer in court, the first black woman to hold statewide office in New York, but impulsive was not one of them. She waited, listened, calculated. The moment passed like a ripple on still water, but the air was now thick with something she hadn't tasted in years: suspicion. Later that night, long after the building emptied, she returned to her office, shut the door, and pulled up the hallway surveillance. She didn't fast forward. She watched the whole clip twice. 9:43 p.m., there was Oliver rolling past the west storage room. No one else. And yet, the whisper had been there. Not just a sound, a conversation, one that carried no physical source, but a very real intent. And the camera had no audio. Convenient. Too convenient. Letitia leaned back, her fingers steepled under her chin, a slow exhale fogging the lower edge of her glasses. This wasn't just some ambient muttering or an echo of street noise. It had weight, pattern, choice. Two distinct languages, both used strategically in foreign intelligence for non-digital message relay. She'd seen this kind of linguistic entanglement before during her brief security clearances, while consulting on legal architecture for counterterrorism reforms. Words like that didn't just hang in air by mistake, and janitors didn't just speak in multiple dialects unless they weren't janitors at all. By 1:30 a.m., she had already ordered a maintenance systems review under pretext of faulty hallway microphones. IT would think it was about equipment. She knew better. She saved the video under a nondescript file name, backed it up. Not to the office server, never trust the central system when you suspect a breach. She burned it onto a private USB, dropped it into her purse, and logged out. Then she did something even more deliberate. Nothing. She filed no report. She made no calls, no warning. No one would even know that Letitia James, the iron hand of New York justice, had heard the whisper that wasn't supposed to exist. She simply sat in her chair, stared at the black window reflecting her own face, and whispered to herself, like a prosecutor prepping a cross-examination. If you are what I think you are, you just walked into the wrong building. The hallway was quiet again the next morning. Coffee brewed, papers shuffled. The receptionist complained about the printer jam. Everything was normal, except Letitia, who from that moment on would no longer see her own office as clean. Not just in the literal sense, but in the way one no longer assumes the rules apply, because someone inside that building didn't just clean floors. They cleaned evidence, cleaned identity, possibly even cleaned history. And the woman named Oliver might be the dirtiest secret of all. Welcome to the kind of story you won't hear on the evening news. A story not about power abused, but about power unnoticed. This isn't fiction. It's what happens when one of the sharpest legal minds in America hears something no one else dares to hear, and instead of dismissing it, decides to follow the echo. She had only just finished locking away that USB evidence of a whisper not made for American ears when the universe, in its ever-witty sense of irony, delivered her the perfect setup for a second act. A package arrived at Letitia James' desk that morning, wrapped with the careless confidence of a gift sent by someone who knew it would be opened by someone who wouldn't ask questions. From Abu Dhabi, the note said. An old law school friend, now a diplomat's wife, sending her the finest hand-roasted Yemeni beans outside of Sana'a. Exotic, harmless, and accompanied by a folded leaflet of instructions written entirely in Arabic. No English translation, no diagrams. A linguistic labyrinth printed on recycled parchment, laced with saffron and imperial smugness. To most, it would have been a charming little challenge. But Letitia James, veteran of subpoenas, redactions, and men who stutter when asked direct questions, saw it as something else. A test. The office kitchen at noon was a sad place. Linoleum floors, vending machine hum, a sink that coughed every time you turned the tap. There, the Attorney General of New York, in her tailored navy suit, stood squinting at foreign script and fiddling with a stovetop mocha pot like a woman trying to defuse a cultural landmine. Just as she reached for her phone to translate boil before filter, a voice behind her broke the tension. "Do you need help with that?" She turned. Oliver, that same cleaning woman with orthopedic shoes, a mop handle too tall for her shoulders, and the kind of expression that suggests she's already seen your browser history. Letitia wasn't sure what startled her more, that Oliver was speaking, or that she sounded pleasant, helpful, a tone that would make a first-grade teacher seem emotionally distant. Letitia, ever composed, simply nodded. Then it happened. Oliver picked up the leaflet, examined the script, and began to read. Not phonetically, not guessing. Reading, word by word, with an accent so clean it might become straight from a Gulf Royal press conference. Her tongue wrapped around the Hijazi dialect, with the kind of confidence only earned through immersion or intelligence training. "You'll want to steep the grounds first to soften the bitterness," she added, her tone soft, almost maternal. "Then don't let it boil. Let it rise 3 times. Letitia blinked. "How do you know this dialect?" she asked, her tone level, but her gaze narrowing like a surgeon looking for scar tissue. Oliver chuckled, like a middle-aged aunt brushing off a compliment about her pie crust. "YouTube. I love Middle Eastern cooking videos." And there it was. The lie. The kind so smooth it insulted your intelligence just by existing. A lie designed not to fool you, but to humiliate you for even questioning it. Letitia smiled, lips tight. "So do I, but I've never heard Nigella Lawson speak like someone who's done time in Riyadh." The silence that followed was the real brew. Not the coffee, not the steam, but the thick realization that someone in this building had just revealed far more than intended, and they'd done it with a mop in hand and a script on their lips. Letitia didn't speak another word. She excused herself, walked back to her office, and printed Oliver's file. Name: Oliver Dean. Birthplace: Baltimore. Education: public high school, class of 1999. Employment: Custodial contractor via a third-party service, no flagged background, no passport, no overseas travel, no known language credentials. In short, no reason in hell she should be able to quote coffee instructions from Medina with the precision of a former spy. Letitia stared at the paper. Government documents have a way of looking trustworthy even when they lie. This one was no different. The photo was unremarkable. The data clean. Too clean. Like a hotel room before a scandal or a politician's tax return. She flipped it over and scrawled 3 words on the back. Verify everything manually. Because this wasn't just a curiosity. It was a pattern. A whisper in the dark followed by a recipe in Arabic. A woman no one noticed until she opened her mouth. And now that she'd slipped, Letitia wasn't about to let her vanish behind a mop again. You see, in politics, danger rarely kicks down the door. It doesn't wear sunglasses or flash a badge. It asks if you need help with your coffee, and if you're not paying attention, it leaves the room with your secrets in its pocket. Letitia James was paying attention now, and the janitor who just made the best damn coffee in the building was officially her new favorite problem. But there was still one thing that didn't sit right. If Oliver had something to hide, why let it show now? Why speak in a dialect most CIA applicants couldn't pass in simulation? Unless, just maybe, she wanted to be noticed. Which raised the more dangerous question. Who was watching who? It wasn't the silence that bothered Letitia James, it was the neatness. The kind of sterile, airtight neatness you'd expect from a billionaire tax return or a war crime investigation that yielded no evidence. She'd seen enough dirt in government files to know that real people smudge. Real people forget deadlines, misspell their middle names, fail driver's tests twice, and give references that sound like cousins with stage fright. But Oliver's personnel file? It read like it was written by the admissions office at Langley. Birth certificate? Crisp. Social security number? Valid. School records? Linear and dull as cold oatmeal. References? Verified and reverent, like the woman had mopped her way into sainthood. Not one red flag. Not even a pink post-it. Letitia flipped through the pages with increasing disgust. The kind that grows when you realize someone has gone out of their way to make things look natural. A perfect background, in DC terms, is like a perfect alibi in a mob trial more suspicious than guilt itself. Nobody's this clean, she muttered, tapping her pen against the header-stamped employee verification. Tier 1 cleared, unless they've been cleaned. So she turned to the only thing in politics more reliable than a paper trail technology. IT pulled up the surveillance from the previous night and applied every noise filter known to mankind, from standard background cancellation to low-end CIA grade frequency isolation. What they found wasn't just sound. It was evidence wearing perfume. 5 words. 2 in classical Arabic fuchsia, precise and grammatical like it came off a UN translator's script. 2 in military accented Russian, the kind that ends in hard consonants and blood. And 1 in Hebrew, spoken in a tone no Israeli child learns at home. Neiman. Loyal. All of it from one voice. One woman. No distortion. No echo. No alibi. Just Oliver, whispering languages not taught in Baltimore public schools, like someone rehearsing for a tribunal that hadn't happened yet. Letitia didn't call for backup. She didn't summon her legal team. What she did was walk, right out of her office, down the hallway, heels clicking like punctuation. She knew where Oliver would be. People like her, the ones who hide brilliance behind bleach, always return to their rhythm. And there she was, by the stairwell, wiping up a stain from a coffee spill that never existed on the cleaning schedule. How poetic. They locked eyes. Oliver gave a small, respectful nod, like she'd just passed the mustard at a polite brunch. Letitia didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply leaned in and delivered her first strike, not as Attorney General, but as a woman raised in Brooklyn who knew when someone was playing smart to be stupid. If you're going to speak in 3 languages at once, Ms. Oliver, next time, at least close the door. The pause that followed was surgical. No gasp, no defense, just a twitch of the jaw, a flicker of recognition. Not fear, not guilt, worse, respect. Because in this town, espionage doesn't always wear suits or operate out of parking garages. Sometimes it scrubs the floors. Sometimes it recites Arabic coffee instructions with elegance. And sometimes it dares to walk past you, humming a Hebrew lullaby under its breath, just to see if you're paying attention. Letitia James was paying attention, and while Oliver was trained to leave no trace, she'd made a mistake that only someone who thought they were smarter than everyone else could make. She underestimated the one woman in New York who never looked away from a mess. Not on her watch, not in her building. And as she turned and walked back toward her office, her heels rang louder than ever. Because now she wasn't just dealing with a mystery. She was hunting the kind of ghost that wrote its own arsum, passed security clearance without flinching, and spoke like the State Department had built her in a lab. But ghosts, no matter how sophisticated, always leave a trail, especially when they're arrogant enough to think the mop is a shield. And Letitia? She had already started the next phase, one where cleaning up messes meant pulling every string until the whole thing unraveled. Because if Ms. Oliver was what Letitia now suspected, a woman with 3 languages on her lips and 0 fingerprints in the system, then this wasn't just about one employee. It was about a system so confident in its blindness, it gave a badge to the one person smart enough to burn the building down and leave no smoke, and Letitia James wasn't about to let her walk out smiling. Not yet. Now the question was no longer who Oliver was. It was who sent her and why New York. Rain had a way of making Washington types feel smarter than they were. Stormy skies, stiff umbrellas, and a dash of artificial urgency always seemed to awaken some latent West Wing fantasy in people who couldn't even organize a filing cabinet. But Letitia James was not in the mood for theatrics that afternoon. She wasn't trying to look presidential. She was trying to catch a ghost in sneakers. So, when a Korean-language government report showed up in the wrong order, 5 pages in the right place, one sandwiched like a rogue paragraph from another case, Letitia didn't assume a printer error. She assumed someone was testing the room, and it wasn't the kind of test you study for. The conference room was packed with senior staffers pretending to be busy. People were throwing around words like metadata breach and transmission lag as if jargon could plug a leak. Letitia let them spin. She let the panic simmer just long enough for the arrogance to rise to the surface. Then she reached across the table, picked up the errant page, and turned ever so casually toward the back of the room. Oliver stood by the mop bucket like a statue commissioned by Homeland Security. Eyes lowered, hands folded, the very picture of deference. But Letitia wasn't fooled. She stepped aside, held the document out, and asked in a tone so dry it could have been taxed, "This page seems out of place. Can you tell?" Oliver didn't hesitate. She took the paper, tilted her head slightly, and let her eyes move in silence for 5 seconds. Just 5. Then, with a voice as calm as elevator music, she said in Korean, Translation. This is out of order. It should be at the end. Dead silence. Not even the interns pretending to type could fake a response. One manager blinked like he just heard someone confess to tax fraud at a brunch. Letitia didn't break eye contact. You speak Korean now? Oliver didn't flinch. Not really. Just enough to spot formatting errors. The delivery was so serene, so antiseptic, it belonged in a training video. Then she handed back the paper, turned around and resumed wiping down the glass partition as if she hadn't just exposed a national security anomaly with the grace of a hotel maid folding towels into swans. But Letitia, she wasn't done. As soon as Oliver exited, she turned to her assistant and dropped the pretense. She didn't just spot the format. She understood the subject headings. Her voice now sharp as a prosecutor's pen. She's been trained in classified document architecture. That wasn't a guess. That was recognition. Here's the problem with a lot of senior government types: they confuse compliance with competence. They think that as long as the badge scans and the coffee's hot, the system's working. But Letitia James wasn't raised on blind trust. She knew that when someone can spot a Korean metadata inconsistency with a broom in one hand, you're either looking at a savant or a shadow trained to move like one. This wasn't a woman who picked up a few language tips from Google Translate. This was a woman who had been taught formally, methodically, and with intent to read structural logic in documents most elected officials couldn't parse without a briefing. This was a woman who knew how to slide through bureaucracies undetected, adjusting punctuation like pressure valves, leaving no fingerprints but always finding the weak joint in the steel frame. And yet, she wore a uniform that said janitorial support. Now, let's pause and reflect on how truly absurd that is. The same government that can't process a passport in under 8 weeks managed to hire a multilingual document analyst to clean light fixtures and nobody asked questions. That's not just negligence. That's performance art. That's a federal agency so bloated with delusions of order that it didn't notice it was feeding access to someone who could probably rewire their database while folding a trash bag. But Letitia noticed, and the moment she did, the room changed. No more benefit of the doubt, no more quiet observation. The hunt had begun, because someone in her office wasn't just bilingual or gifted or quirky. They were deliberate, they were placed, and most damning of all, they were watching testing, seeing how much they could get away with before someone like Letitia James called their bluff. And Oliver? She just raised the stakes, because only one kind of person corrects a classified Korean report out of nowhere, someone who's seen too many not to recognize the structure. So now the real question wasn't how she knew. It was why she needed Letitia to know she knew. Letitia James believed in many things: legal precedent, chain of custody, the power of a subpoena, but trust. Trust was reserved for dogs and delusions. Which is precisely why, 3 days after a janitor casually deconstructed a Korean document and walked away like she'd just wiped a countertop, Letitia decided to throw bait into the water. And not just any bait, a loyalty oath. The kind of stunt that would make a CIA recruiter smirk and a bureaucrat sweat. She called it a compliance readiness simulation, which in government speak is code for we're about to find out who's lying and who's incompetent, and sometimes they're the same person. The setup was simple, theatrical, and brutally specific. A mock ceremony in the main briefing room. All department employees were handed printed oaths, one in English, one in Russian, and one in modern standard Arabic. Letitia made sure they were linguistically sound, region-neutral, and diplomatically dull. Nothing fancy. Just enough to see who stumbled, who skimmed, and most importantly, who corrected. Enter Oliver, dressed in her standard-issue uniform, gray pants, scuffed white sneakers, and a demeanor so forgettable it could have passed for camouflage. She stood by the far glass wall, wiping fingerprints like they were national secrets. Not participating, not engaged, just cleaning. The moment came halfway through the Arabic reading. A young assistant from the litigation team, overconfident and underqualified, mangled the phrase "commitment to loyalty," switching a soft A to a hard A, harmless to anyone not trained. Catastrophic if you understood the difference between promising to uphold duty versus confessing to betrayal in classical Arabic syntax. Oliver didn't miss a beat. Without raising her voice, without turning her head, she spoke clearly. That's pronounced wafa, not wafa. Stress changes meaning. The room froze. Letitia didn't even blink. She let the silence sit. Let the assistant swallow his ego like a jawbreaker. Let the echo of Oliver's correction ring out like a sniper shot with a suppressor. After the exercise, Letitia did not confront. She invited. Walk with me. They walked side by side down the west corridor, the kind that absorbs sound and tension in equal measure. Neither looked at the other. It wasn't that kind of moment. Letitia was deliberate, surgical. She waited until they passed the last visible camera. Then, in Yiddish, old, ancestral, sharp as bone and bread, she asked, "Wer bist du? Who are you? Not what's your name or where are you from. That would have been polite. This was something else. This was coded, deep. The kind of question you don't ask unless you know you won't like the answer." Oliver responded without hesitation, in the same Yiddish but older, dustier, the kind taught in shadows and carried across borders. "Die was ihr seid nicht geboren zu sehen." The one you weren't born to see. Letitia stopped walking, turned her head for the first time. It wasn't shock that crossed her face, it was recognition. The kind you give a chess opponent when they move a bishop where only a queen should go. Because here's the thing about espionage in American politics, it rarely shows up in a trench coat. It arrives with a mop and multilingual passive aggression. It corrects your grammar, folds your towels, and reads your intelligence files while pretending to vacuum. And what's more absurd is how many elected officials wouldn't notice it if it danced naked on their campaign finance reports. But Letitia noticed. Because unlike most of her peers, she didn't mistake silence for submission or blandness for obedience. She'd spent her career prosecuting predators who wore neckties and perverts who donated to parks. She knew better than to trust the performance of simplicity, and now she was staring into the linguistic abyss of a woman who had just exposed herself not by accident, but by choice. Which made the next question even more chilling. If Oliver wanted to be seen, then who exactly was she trying to send that message to? And more importantly, why now? The folder hit the table with a soft slap, but the silence that followed was far louder. Caroline Levitt, ex-Intel tactician turned freelance security whisperer, sat across from Letitia James with the expression of someone who'd just seen a ghost, only this one had filled out a W-2 form and vacuumed the governor's hallway. She flipped the final page of the background file and let it hang open like a crime scene photograph. Letitia didn't need to look. She already knew the answer was going to be satisfying. It was going to be surgical. 17 years ago, a photo ID was filed under the name Oliver Dean. Standard enough. Hair parted right. No visible scars, eyes distant but cooperative like someone posing for a passport while mentally plotting a coup. Fast forward to the present day, and the face-cleaning coffee stains off the AG's hallway bore a haunting resemblance. With one problem. The orbital ridge was reshaped, jawline too symmetrical, ears slightly lower, all subtle, all legal if you were trying to impersonate a cousin for a fake license. But this wasn't a back-alley DMV scam. This was engineered obfuscation. Caroline didn't editorialize. She never did. That was part of what made her dangerous. She recited facts like a priest recites confessions, clinical, uninvested. There's trace evidence of facial restructuring, likely partial surgical sculpting. Vascular mapping suggests premeditated biometric manipulation. She looked up, calm as still water. In layman's terms, she changed her face and left just enough of it intact to pass casual recognition software. Letitia said nothing, just leaned forward, cracked her knuckles, and nodded for her to continue. Name Oliver Dean shows up on a 2005 provisional registry list for an Israeli military linguistics fellowship. Program was dissolved. No final records. No listed nationality. Cross-border applicant. And here's the interesting part. That program never accepted Americans. Only those with dual security clearances or active enlistment in allied forces. Letitia raised one eyebrow. So we have someone who was accepted into a program she legally couldn't enter, under a name that doesn't match a citizenship she doesn't have. Correct, Caroline replied. And that's the part that makes it elegant. Not sloppy. Deliberate. She was never in the system not as an error, as a design. Then came the kicker. Oliver's social security number clean, valid, and used on every payroll stub and W-2 for the last 5 years matched a man who died in Ohio in 1991. A factory worker. No kids, no wife, no close relatives. Just a body, a forgotten file, and now, apparently, a recycled identity, reactivated in 2017. Just in time for her to apply to a federal janitorial contractor program with access to judicial offices. You know how hard it is to beat SSA fraud checks? Caroline asked. Deadpan. You can't fake your way past them without inside help. And whoever did this didn't just pass. They buried the original death certificate under an employment audit in a state 2 time zones away. That takes funding, access, and a motivation stronger than I want to mop floors. Letitia didn't flinch. She didn't need the dramatic pause. She'd already moved past the how. Her brain was 10 steps ahead, skipping the who and drilling straight into the why. She reached across the table, folded the file slowly, and slid it back to Caroline without a word. Then she stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the rain sliding down the glass like it was trying to wash the government clean. I don't care where she's from, Letitia said finally, her voice low, deliberate, and sharpened like a lawyer's closing argument. I don't care if she was born in Haifa or Harrisburg, if she trained in Tel Aviv or took ballet in Tehran. I don't need to know where she came from. She turned around. Cold stare. No emotion. No confusion. Just focus. I need to know what she's doing here. And for who. That was the line in the sand. Not because Letitia feared being lied to. She expected that. It came with the job. But because someone had weaponized the myth of invisibility. They'd crafted an entire identity so meticulously, so blandly, that it passed under every radar until it walked into her kitchen and corrected an Arabic vowel like it was nothing. And now she had to consider the unthinkable. That her office, her staff, her whole command structure could have been penetrated not by a hack, not by a breach, not by a leak, but by a woman with a broom and 17 flags in her back pocket. Because while most security threats show up as blips on a screen or red flags in a database, this one had walked in through the service entrance, smiling, cleaning, listening. The kind of operative who didn't need to run, because she knew you wouldn't chase her until it was already too late. But Letitia had seen enough late, and this time she wasn't letting the ghost write the ending. Not on her floor, not in her city. The only question now: what happens when a woman trained to disappear is finally seen by the one person in America who doesn't flinch at the sight of a war dressed in silence? It wasn't the siren that caught Letitia's attention. It was the silence that followed, too coordinated, too precise, too calm for a supposed chemical emergency. In theory, the entire floor was supposed to dissolve into procedural chaos. Interns tripping over their own laptops, middle managers forgetting which color badge granted stairwell access, and that one guy from procurement demanding to see an exit strategy in writing. Instead, what Letitia saw on the footage wasn't panic, it was choreography. And leading the dance, a woman with a mop and a command tone sharper than most four-star generals. Carolina's plan had been simple: manufacture a scenario designed to trigger reflexes, not rehearsals. If Oliver was what they suspected, a sleeper asset trained in covert extraction and adaptive infiltration, then a sudden emergency would force her to react. Not think, not pretend, just move. And that's exactly what she did. When the alarm blared pre-recorded, harmless but indistinguishable from a real hazmat event, Oliver didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She didn't even pause to ask for instructions. She pivoted, located 3 disoriented interns fumbling with their phones, and with chilling efficiency, ushered them down the east corridor while issuing a single command in clipped, native-level German. Durch den Ostkorridor. Schneller. Translation: East Corridor. Move. The audio team reviewed the playback 3 separate times. Then, once more, with headphones, slow motion, and a German linguistics expert on speed dial. The verdict was unanimous. The voice belonged to Oliver. The accent, flawless. The intonation, military, not academic. And the phrasing, well, it wasn't something you picked up from a Berlitz CD or a Berlin techno playlist. It was the kind of phrase barked in cold rooms during Black Ops drills, not recited over bratwurst. Letitia didn't yell. She didn't rage. She didn't even bother to summon the rest of the security team. She called Caroline into her office, shut the door behind her, and delivered the kind of line that should be carved into the base of every marble statue in the State Department. We've spent too many years profiling threats by their flags. Maybe it's time we start profiling them by their grammar, because this wasn't just a linguistic slip. It was an audible fingerprint. A military dialect German command delivered under duress by a janitor whose resume listed nothing beyond public school and custodial services. That wasn't a mistake. That was arrogance. Arrogance in assuming no one would notice, that no one should notice. Because after all, who pays attention to the help when the lights go out? Letitia did. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed, voice like cold steel. "You know what this is?" she said, not waiting for Caroline to answer. "It's not a breach. It's a test. We're being tested. Someone planted her here not to steal files, but to see how long we'd let her mop the floor before we figured out she could run a field unit." Caroline stayed silent. Because what was there to say? When a woman cleans offices by day and gives orders like a Bundeswehr instructor by reflex, you're not looking at a mistake. You're looking at design. And the irony? Most intelligence budgets are spent trying to decode digital chatter, trace offshore transfers, or scan for Russian-bought server space. Meanwhile, the real threat was walking past security every day with a staff badge and a spray bottle. Because what better disguise than invisibility? What better cover than labor? What better way to infiltrate a system drunk on hierarchy than to enter through the basement and rise through the ductwork? Letitia turned back to the screen and watched the footage again, frame by frame. Oliver's posture, her pace, her command. Not an ounce of fear, not a drop of doubt. Just cold, rehearsed control. Next time, she murmured, she'll lead more than interns out. She'll lead data, maybe people, maybe worse. This wasn't just a who is she problem anymore. This was a how many like her are there and who trained them problem. And Letitia James had just realized she wasn't running a legal office anymore. She was running a war zone with fluorescent lighting. Letitia James had reviewed many case files in her career, some grotesque, others grotesquely stupid. But this one was in a category of its own, espionage dressed as janitorial efficiency. And now, the National Security Office had gifted her the missing puzzle piece from across the Atlantic, delicately labeled for internal eyes only, which in bureaucratic code meant you're about to lose sleep. The file was sparse, but pointed. Ori Levine status, missing. Last seen, European field deployment, 7 years ago. Trained, Herzliya, Israel. The words were sterile, but the implication was radioactive. Herzliya wasn't a summer camp. It was where Israel trained its chessboard ghosts operatives who could vanish between borders and reappear as consultants, translators, or, in this case, building maintenance. The biometric match, 89% accuracy between Oliver Dean and Ori Levine. The remaining 11%? Eroded skin patterns, consistent with chemical abrasion, intentional. Because nothing says I'm not who you think I am quite like sanding off your identity. Letitia didn't call for an arrest. She called for a table. A room with no windows, no staff, no theatrics. Just her, Caroline, and the woman who had been scrubbing state secrets off door frames in her spare time. Oliver was escorted in no handcuffs, no pretense of coercion. She walked like she'd been invited, sat like she owned the chair. Letitia slid the file across the table without a word, then opened it to the photo marked Ori Levine 2006. A younger face, same intensity, less dust. Letitia's tone was direct, absent of courtroom flair. She wasn't building a case. She was cutting one open. This your real name? Ori Levine? Oliver didn't blink, didn't fidget, just stared at the photo like it was an ex-lover she'd buried in a past life. Then finally, softly, but without apology, she said, I was never here to hurt you. I was here to see if someone else would. It was the kind of answer designed not to soothe, but to haunt. Carolina's eyes narrowed slightly, reading between syllables the way most people read headlines. Letitia, however, didn't flinch. Shed-faced men who embezzled pension funds with handshakes and priests who covered felony rape with press releases. This was cleaner, honest, in a way that insulted protocol but respected her intellect. You infiltrated a state building under a false identity, Letitia said, folding her hands. You activated a stolen social security number, forged federal employment clearance, manipulated biometric records, and accessed restricted files. Oliver remained calm. All without harming anyone. All without stealing a bite. Letitia tilted her head, unimpressed. That's like a thief bragging he broke into the house but didn't take the silverware. You still crossed the line. I had to know, Oliver said, and for the first time, there was something human, almost pained in her voice. You want to believe your walls are solid, but the real danger never walks through the front. It gets hired through procurement. The room fell silent. Because she wasn't wrong. Government security had been reduced to badge scanners and HR spreadsheet systems built not to protect, but to produce metrics. And while agencies spent billions on encryption and firewall updates, the real vulnerabilities mopped their floors, updated printer drivers, and ran quietly efficient lives beneath fluorescent lighting. Letitia sat back, tapping her nail on the folder like a metronome. "Who sent you?" Oliver didn't smile. That would have been too easy. Instead, she gave Letitia something far more dangerous than information ambiguity. "If I told you," she said, "you'd spend the rest of your year chasing shadows instead of cleaning your own house." And that was the problem. Letitia didn't like shadows. She liked subpoenas, evidence, depositions. But now she was dealing with someone who spoke in riddles and walked through classified corridors like she was shopping for new lies to wear. Someone who didn't come to destroy but to observe, to audit the very system that assumed it was immune. Which begged the next question, the one Letitia didn't want to ask out loud. If Ori Levine had just proven how easy it was to slip in unnoticed, how many others had never needed to? And more terrifying still, were they already inside? The real problem with ghosts is not that they haunt you, expect that. It's that they sometimes fix the plumbing while they're floating through your walls. That's where Ori Levine, formerly known as Oliver Dean, possibly known by 10 other names in 10 other countries, didn't just blur the line between spy and savior. She swept it clean. Caroline Levitt sat back in the war room they'd converted into a secure debriefing space, arms crossed, face unreadable. But her voice, when it came, was precise. She wasn't here to extract classified material. She was here to audit the rot. Quietly, thoroughly, from within. That didn't make it less terrifying. What Caroline laid out wasn't a list of violations. It was a post-mortem of a system that never realized it had already been cut open. Ori hadn't disabled firewalls or stolen files in the dead of night. She had corrected them, noted format inconsistencies in archived legal memos, flagged misfiled evidence logs that would have derailed prosecution, reorganized mislabeled multilingual documentation like someone reverse engineering a collapse. Her presence hadn't compromised justice, it had patched it. And that was the most damning twist, because she didn't do it for the state of New York. She did it to see if the state of New York even noticed. But while Ori had been quietly serving as the system's janitor savant, Letitia's tech team had run their own diagnostics, and the deeper they dug, the darker it got. A full-scale sweep of network traffic revealed a chilling truth. Ori had mapped the entire human capital structure of the AG's office. Every employee's metadata trail, their digital footprint, salary log, clearance level, and campaign finance correlations all cross-referenced, cleaned, and exported into a dead-end server in what appeared to be a sandboxed data vault. Letitia stood with her arms folded, staring out the window while the rain once again made its ritual descent across the glass. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but surgical. "That's not checking," she said. "That's espionage." Ori, seated calmly at the head of the room like she was waiting for a dessert menu, didn't flinch. She didn't play coy. She didn't bat her eyelashes like some congressional witness coached to death by 3 lawyers and a bottle of Lexapro. She looked Letitia dead in the eyes and asked the one question this city was never built to answer. And if I hadn't checked, what would I have found? That stopped the air cold, because buried beneath the outrage, beneath the patriotic theater and policy jargon, was the real reason this moment stung. Letitia knew she didn't have an answer, and if someone like Ori Foreign, uninvited, unaccounted for, could step into her house and spot the rot before anyone else, then maybe the problem wasn't the ghost. Maybe it was the foundation. What Ori had exposed wasn't a national security breach, it was a cultural one. The arrogant assumption that loyalty could be measured by payroll records. That trust came pre-installed with a staff badge. That the most dangerous threats wore different flags or spoke different tongues, rather than sat in budget meetings and signed off on procurement contracts without reading the fine print. Caroline broke the silence with a rare note of dry irony. She didn't come to burn it down. She came to see if it was already on fire, and therein lay the real indictment. Ori had walked through the very heart of a justice system armed with nothing but a name no one questioned, and an ear for the kind of mistakes nobody else hears. She didn't sabotage. She observed. She corrected. She mapped. And then she waited. Because Ori didn't need to steal what was already being lost through negligence. She just needed someone in power to notice it. Which left Letitia with a question that had no satisfying answer. If her own office could be surveilled, diagnosed, and redrawn from the inside by one unarmed woman with a talent for silence, what did that say about every other building she didn't control? And more urgently, if Ori had done this alone, who was training the ones that didn't leave fingerprints behind? The prison uniform didn't suit her, but then again, nothing ever truly fit a woman who'd slipped between identities like they were coats. Letitia James stood at the edge of the glass, arms crossed, watching Ori Levine, the woman formerly known as Oliver Dean, the ghost who mopped floors with one hand and read federal architecture with the other. No cuffs, no theatrics, just gray fabric, and a silence loud enough to flatten entire institutions. Ori sat still in the detainment cell, back straight, hands calm, face unreadable as if she were evaluating the prison more than inhabiting it. 17 languages, half a dozen nations worth of training, a skill set that could dismantle a data network in 6 keystrokes and rebuild it better by lunch, now sealed behind laminated glass in a room not designed for her kind. She wasn't a criminal. She was an indictment of a system that hired for loyalty and screened for sums, never noticing the applicants who already knew which servers were misconfigured and which judges took lunch at the same time every day. Letitia didn't blink, didn't move. She just studied her like a surgeon prepping for a final cut. Because what stood behind that glass wasn't just a person, it was a mirror. A reflection of everything America pretended to see and everything it absolutely didn't. 3 days later, Letitia stepped behind a podium, cameras blinking, journalists hungry for blood, scandal, or ideally both. But there were no theatrics, no buzzwords about rogue actors or foreign threats. No plea for calm, just clarity. A government employee has been detained under suspicion of internal surveillance and unauthorized data access, she said, voice firm, eyes colder than protocol. But this investigation is not about one individual. It's about the blind spots we defend with paperwork. The real question is, who let her in and why did no one ask sooner? You could hear a collective inhale behind the cameras, not the gasp of outrage, but the subtle tightening of political arteries, because she wasn't talking about passwords or IT departments anymore. She was talking about trust. Later that afternoon, Caroline found her alone in the office, arms folded again, eyes fixed on nothing. "You going to prosecute her?" she asked, voice low. Letitia didn't look away. "I'm not interested in prosecuting Ori. A beat. I'm interested in how many more Oris are walking these halls, filing paperwork, brewing coffee, carrying classified waste, smiling, silent, watching. It wasn't paranoia, it was precision, because in a government so addicted to hierarchy that it never questions who folds the napkins, the perfect disguise isn't invisibility, it's usefulness. They watched from the stone steps as Ori was escorted to the secure van. No chains, no struggle, just a woman walking like she was being transferred, not captured. As the door closed, Ori turned only briefly and said in perfect, unfaltering English, "You were the only one who saw through me. That's why I didn't run." Letitia didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't play to the crowd. She answered in Hebrew, clear, firm, and ancient as consequence. Because this time, we were the ones watching, and with that, the door shut. But the real story, the one that would never make the news cycle, wasn't about betrayal. It was about what betrayal looked like in a government that didn't believe it could be fooled, and how sometimes the sharpest act of patriotism is making the empire see its own reflection.